What's really happening in Gaza? Is it a ceasefire or Islamic fire on Washington and Jerusalem? Join us to find out. Khaled Aboutameh, my dear friend and colleague of so many decades, there is a misunderstanding, to put it mildly, about what's happening in Gaza. This is Islamic warfare, which has hills and valleys, which has rests and resupply, rearm, re-energize. We're in the middle of a war, and my sense is that the West, led by the great Donald Trump for Israel, believes that we really are in a framework of a ceasefire. We've got to make some order here.
Look, Dan, for Hamas, this is a temporary ceasefire, or what we call a hudna. And we've been to this movie before. Hamas does not see this as a peace agreement. It does not see it as a new era for normalization or for coexistence with Israel. They see it as an opportunity to rearm, regroup. And that's why their actions on the ground suggest that they are trying to reassert control over those parts of Gaza that they still control. And no one is stopping them. This is very dangerous. What we are seeing now in the areas from where the IDF withdrew is the reality of October 6th. We see Hamas militias on the streets. We see Hamas institutions operating openly. We see that even Hamas spokesmen have resurfaced in Gaza and are now giving interviews and talking openly. And this is a very problematic scenario that does not bode well for the future of the region. So we need to be very careful. Yes, we are still in the first phase of the Trump plan, which is not a peace deal, by the way. These are understandings between Israel, the United States, and some Arab countries in which Hamas is indirectly involved. So we need to be very careful how we frame it, and we need to look at what is happening on the ground. We are talking about Hamas trying to create new facts on the ground.
You know, Khaled, let's talk about those new facts. And one of them is, and I think people are going to hear it for the first time in this program, Qatar and Turkey are advising Hamas how to maintain control, how to invent themselves as a ghost network on the one hand, and as what you call the public security face in civilian clothes. You see them looking very, new NYPD, New York police-like on the corners of Gaza, maintaining traffic control, when what is happening is a complete rebranding, repositioning, and remobilization of Hamas. And what they've done is to corner many of those Arab countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Morocco, the UAE, the moderate Trump alliance, I would call them, that are very amenable to Israel. But what the Hamas have done with the advice of Turkey and Qatar, two Muslim Brotherhood sponsors of the Hamas, is to co-opt the Arab partners who signed or initialed, if you will, on this understanding. You said it very well. It is not an international legal agreement, the 20-point plan. It is a political set of understandings that are reflected in the 20 points, and Hamas has very ingeniously co-opted and cornered much of the Arab world on this point.
First of all, this plan, the Trump plan, has no legal
anchor. There's no or mechanism.
Yeah, or mechanism. And it doesn't even set dates or deadlines for implementation. And this is something that our viewers need to take into account. But then you mentioned Hamas taking control, again, over Gaza City and those parts from where the IDF withdrew with the help of Qatar and Turkey. But there's something else that people are not paying attention to. Hamas is also trying to enter into the proposed technocratic government from the side door. Hamas is involved in the formation of this administration. Hamas is saying, I want to choose representatives, my own representatives, in this new body that will govern Gaza. So what have we done? We've gone back to those days when Hamas decided everything that happens inside Gaza. And this is happening, by the way, under the auspices of the Egyptians, because the Egyptians have called for a meeting of the Palestinian factions in Cairo to discuss the future of Gaza, to discuss the formation of this administration that will run Gaza in the post-war era. And who's invited? Fatah, the PFLP, the DFLP, Islamic Jihad. So we find ourselves going back to the same, the same scenarios we saw in the past. And this is something that people have to notice.
They have to notice something unique about Egypt's position. Egypt is in a very sensitive and even impossible position that Turkey and Qatar are not. On the one hand, here, the Trump 20-point plan, for those who have been following the developments in the plan, is very close to what Egypt had proposed some months ago, which was called the Egyptian Arab League Plan, which stood in direct contradiction to the original Trump plan, which was called the Riviera Plan. Now we have a plan that Egypt signed off on with both hands, and that is to prevent any sort of flow of Gazans into Egypt, other than the 80 or 90,000 that paid $5,000 or $10,000 a head, as we said in our last podcast last week, to stay in Cairo, and that was a business. But besides that, Egypt would rather die on its sword than allow a massive flooding of Gazans into Egypt. So it got what it wanted in this particular arrangement. What it got, and sometimes you say, be careful what you wish for, because with Hamas still in Gaza, it poses the same threat to Egypt, not only directly, but indirectly, because the majority of the over 100 million Egyptians actually show great sympathy for Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood.
It's not only Egyptians, Dan. It's the Arab masses, I call them.
The Arab street.
The Arab street, yes. We see pro-Hamas demonstrations in Jordan, in Algeria, in Tunisia, in Yemen, even in Morocco. And the Arab leaders know this. So this is why there is a gap between what the Arab leaders say in public and what they say in private conversations with U.S. and European officials. In public, when you listen to Arab heads of state, they sound like, they are accepting the Trump plan. They want to get rid of Hamas. They want to see Hamas disarmed. They want to see Hamas excluded from a future governing body. But they, at the same time, these leaders know that the Arab street, as you mentioned, is much more sympathetic to Hamas, and that's why they're very careful. At the end of the day, I believe that despite the promises by the Arab leaders, by Qatar, by Egypt, by other Islamic countries such as Turkey, despite the promises to comply with the Trump administration, they will not put pressure on Hamas, and they will certainly not send forces to Gaza to disarm Hamas by force or by violent means. This is not going to happen because the Arab leaders know that the day they do it, their people will revolt against them.
Absolutely. And that is why the deep, dark secret here, Khalid, which we'll reveal on Al-Shaqqa Al-Sablana, on Our Middle East, is that everyone knew that the 20-point plan was an agreement to free the living hostages from Israel held in Hamas's terror dungeons. That was the whole reason that it
and the deceased.
And the deceased,
yeah.
Which we're getting back in dribs and drabs.
Phase 1 of the Trump plan has still not been completed.
Correct. And everyone's talking about phase 2, which is a major mistake because basically that is what Hamas wants. On the one hand, they want phase 2, but they want to drag it out for months and months and months and even beyond that, so that the plan is that Hamas receives the $50 to $70 billion in reconstruction money, and that this is a way of refilling the Hamas coffers to assert control with the help of the Turks and the Qataris, who are insisting to come into Gaza to be part of recovery plans. But we don't need Turkey to be part of a dead corpse Israeli body recovery plans. The Israelis are the best in the world at that type of technology and recovery. This is the Qatar Hamas proposition of coming into the territory, which Prime Minister Netanyahu and Israel completely rejects, is a very dangerous prospect, because it gives state Muslim Brotherhood empowered state sanction to Hamas in, as you said before a little early in the show, to maintain control over Gaza. This is very, very dangerous. And what is very important, I think, for us to convey is that we are in the middle of an Islamist jihadistic war that's being, again, prosecuted, but with the help, unfortunately, of a legitimized international coalition that Hamas very brilliantly is hiding behind and using as international cover as its own legitimacy picks up. One last point here. The 60 Minutes interview with Leslie Stahl, Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner. Very problematic moment when Steve Witkoff tells a story about meeting Khalil al-Hayya, the major Hamas Politburo leader, in Sharm el-Sheikh. And Witkoff tells the story about sending his condolences to his son, who was also a terrorist, eliminated in the Israeli strike, and then sharing that his son Andrew passed away tragically, but that he thinks that by connecting with him on a personal level is going to influence and convince Hamas to moderate, when in fact it will do the absolute opposite. And it was no coincidence that there was a terror attack by Hamas within hours of that tete-a-tete between the two.
I totally agree, Dan, and I think those who are talking to Hamas need to be very careful about how they deal with Hamas, because although you have good intentions, you could end up legitimizing Hamas and humanizing them, making them look as if they are, people who really care about human life, people who share, the same sentiments that normal, ordinary people have around the world, people who can grieve, who can... and so this is a process that could lead to the legitimization of Hamas, and it's very dangerous. Hamas is a terrorist organization that should have no future in Gaza at all. Negotiating with Hamas is a mistake, by the way. Negotiating with Hamas about the future of Gaza is a mistake. Negotiating with Hamas about the release of the hostages is okay. I'm fine with it. But why are you negotiating with Hamas about the future of Gaza? Why are you talking to them about disarmament and de-radicalization and the technocratic government? They should have no role in this. They should just, surrender or be eliminated, period. But negotiating with them, it could take, weeks and months and years, and Hamas is trying to buy time because the negotiations will continue while Hamas on the ground will consolidate or tighten its grip on the population, and you haven't achieved anything, because at the end of the day, what happens is who has control on the ground, and on the ground it will be Hamas. You can continue to talk about all the other issues in phase 2 and phase 3, and it won't change anything. The words de-radicalization and demilitarization do not exist in Hamas's lexicon. This is a jihadist group. The fighting has stopped, but the jihad has not stopped. This is just another phase for Hamas. As I mentioned earlier, this is a hudna, a pause in the fighting, so that we can regroup, rearm, and continue the jihad sooner or later.
Absolutely. Khalid, as you lay out this very important point about the hills and valleys, the pauses in jihad. Jihad has high-intensity warfare, middle-intensity warfare, and low-intensity warfare. And it's all part of jihad. There's diplomatic jihad, there's financial jihad, there's media jihad. There are all kinds of jihad because they're all part of the context of this long Islamist war. And I think it is rather extraordinary that the United States hasn't completely learned this lesson from its very, very tough object lessons that it faced and learned, supposed to have learned after 9/11 in Iraq, from Al-Qaeda, in Afghanistan. And in the end, who were the first to congratulate the Taliban?
Hamas.
Thank you. You and I spoke by phone immediately after
and I
the retreat.
reported that back then. I was writing for the Jerusalem Post. It was one of the items that I posted. And that's why, the question then is, when I hear U.S. officials talk about the need for Hamas to behave, what do you mean? Would you ever talk about the need for Al-Qaeda or ISIS to behave? These people don't understand such language. These people have to vanish. They have to be removed by force. This is the only language they understand. But if you say, "Oh, they need to behave and they need to do this," and they're not going to listen to you. And even if they say yes, they don't really mean it. Hamas is not going to disarm voluntarily, because if they lay down their weapons, that would be tantamount to suicide.
Absolutely. So it would be suicide for them, and it would be, by extension, suicide perceptually by other jihadi organizations that are watching very, very carefully as to what happens in Gaza. And on this point, I want to enlarge our conversation to the regional level, because what Hamas realizes is that small Gaza Strip, that 2,000 square kilometers of desert strip, actually has a stranglehold on what is happening across the region. What do we mean here? You and I have talked about this off air. There is a dual. There are two axes right now in the Middle East: Turkey, Qatar, Iran, to an extent, and opposite, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, the United States, and I would argue Israel. And these axes are at war with one another in a Cold War, if you will. And a lot of this is playing out in the very hot war going on in Gaza right now. And I think that we've got to understand that there are major regional implications of what is happening in Gaza, because if Gaza is not stabilized and secured and Hamas not defeated, they will never get to the stabilization, the normalization, and the Trump plan for prosperity for the Middle East that the president brought with him in May 2025 when he was welcomed by 12 major, beautiful Arabian horses in Riyadh. That will not happen, and Hamas knows that it is the last stop. What they say, the real stops here. We used to say the buck stops here. And Hamas's mission today, which is to prevent the stabilization and the securing and the normalization across the Middle East, was exactly the reason they attacked Israel on October the 7th, 2023, which was, as you've said many times, to prevent the impending normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. You agree?
This is what Hamas has been saying. Hamas says that one of its declared goals by attacking Israel on October 7, 2023, is to, quote unquote, foil or thwart normalization between Israel and the Arab countries. But there's another issue I wanted to point out here, Dan. We are hearing reports now that Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates are not that happy about the presence of Qatar, or the involvement of Qatar and Turkey in Gaza. And they've even been sending messages, according to these reports, to the Trump administration that they will not be involved or in the reconstruction of Gaza or in other plans concerning Gaza, as long as Qatar is there and as long as Hamas does not lay down its weapons. And this is something very important, because if the Arabs are not united on Gaza, then you will not see a process of reconstruction, and Gaza will fall again into the hands of Qatar, Turkey, and behind them Iran. And that's why we're back to square one. We would rather see the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia in Gaza. It's much better than having Qatar and Turkey in Gaza, because Qatar and Turkey are Hamas. They are Muslim Brotherhood.
Absolutely. Muslim Brotherhood, which means they basically grant state legitimacy to Hamas itself, which is a major problem, because the more that Hamas is legitimized, which is Hamas's goal, the more that the PA is going to be delegitimized. And in fact, even though the 20-point plan calls for some sort of pathway for the PA to return, the PA is just as problematic as Hamas, and the PA and Hamas have been in a very violent struggle for control of the Palestinian street, which today would vote Hamas in again, because the Palestinian street votes its pocketbook in the sense of corruption of the PA, and with everything that's gone on, would still, in terms of the legislative and presidential, if you will, elections, would still vote in Hamas. Hamas is leading.
The Palestinian Authority remains part of the problem, not the solution. The Palestinian Authority has failed to implement major reforms. It has failed to change in many ways. It has failed to convince the international community, including the Americans and the Israelis, that it is opposed to terrorism, that it wants a new approach. And that's why I don't see the Palestinian Authority being able to play a role inside Gaza right now. In the past few days, by the way, the Palestinian Authority has escalated its rhetoric against Hamas. We see attacks on Hamas. We see them accusing Hamas of violating the law by carrying out public executions. And we see in the Palestinian media, the Palestinian Authority media, accusations have resurfaced that Hamas is ISIS. And it looks almost as if it's taken from, the Israeli book. So this does not show, what do we learn from these attacks on Hamas? That the Palestinian Authority is not really interested in going back to Gaza. They'd rather stay here in the West Bank, where they are protected by Israel. They're sitting there. They continue to conduct security coordination with Israel, but at the same time, their rhetoric is bad. They are inciting against Israel. The Palestinian Authority has been playing a double game. On the one hand, they incite their people against Israel. They radicalize their people against Israel. On the other hand, behind the scenes, they work with Israel through security coordination. So the Palestinian Authority is not a very reliable partner. It's not a very credible partner. And I'm not even sure that people in Gaza want the Palestinian Authority, by the way.
The Hamas has been trying to take over the Palestinian Authority through the back door, the side door, and the front door for the last 20 years. That's been very clear. And in fact, you and I, who've worked for so many years together, have pointed out that the second intifada was an intifada as much between the PLO and the Hamas as it was between Arafat and Israel, using the Hamas one way or the other and competing with the Hamas. This has been going on for an awfully long time. The West has been unaware of this, and that's what we're trying to do on Our Middle East, is to expose the Middle East in its own context and in its own idiom to the West, because there is so much of a disconnect between the two continents.
At the end of the day, Dan, the Palestinians are in a crisis. It's called a leadership crisis. They are caught between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. And both of these governments or both of these leaderships have failed the Palestinians. They have deprived their people of the international aid. They have radicalized their people. They have led their people from one disaster to another. The PLO led the Palestinians from one disaster to another between the 70s in Jordan, later in the 80s in Lebanon, then in the West Bank during the second Intifada. Hamas, look where we are now. Since 2007, they have been killing Palestinians. They have been murdering Israelis, attacking Israel, and now they have brought death and destruction on their own people. So we are talking about two leaderships that are not, that have failed their own people. It's time for the Palestinians to search for a third party or, an alternative to these two bodies. And as long as they don't have an alternative, we will just continue revolving in a vicious cycle. We're not going to see the Palestinians being able to move forward or, establish good governance, or even, engage in any kind of a peace process with Israel. What Israel is facing and has long been facing are two Palestinian camps. One of them does not want to make peace with Israel, and the second camp cannot make peace with Israel. This is what we are facing.
Absolutely. And in fact, this puts Israel in a very important and sensitive position to prevail upon its greatest ally, the United States, as to what's really going on, because there is a real danger here that Hamas recognizes and that Hamas is intensifying and inflaming. And that is to drive a wedge between the United States and Israel through its jihadi activity in Gaza and position Israel as the problem as opposed to the solution. Now, there is the danger here is that it plays into Trump's vision for the Middle East. And the vision will not be accomplished until this jihad in Gaza is neutralized. And that puts Israel in the position of explaining and influencing and convincing the president as to what is really happening and why we've heard the president make declarations and representations recently very tough against Hamas. But Israel's job now is to expose the Hamas every day and every week so that the president doesn't get annoyed and lose patience with Israel, because his regional vision is not going to be accomplished before this acute problem is taken care of in Gaza. What's your thinking on that as we end our discussion today?
You're absolutely right, Dan. I think that Hamas is engaged in deception right now. Hamas has lowered the volume towards America, towards the U.S. In the past 2 years, the policy of Hamas was to accuse the United States of being complicit in Israeli crimes, of being the big Satan. They've been condemning the Biden administration. Initially, they condemned the Trump administration. They said awful things about them, that they are behind Israel. They are, they are also responsible for the so-called genocide. But in recent weeks, I detect a change in Hamas's tone. Suddenly, they respect President Trump. Suddenly, they are calling on Trump to put pressure on Israel to comply with the agreements. Suddenly, there are no more attacks by Hamas on the Trump administration and on Trump in person as they were in the past. And this is the deception that I'm talking about. And I think the Trump administration should not fall for this. Hamas is Hamas, and they have not changed. Hamas is not pro-America. Hamas does not believe in Israel's right to exist. Hamas is a jihadist movement. In my opinion, Hamas is not different than ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other Islamist groups that see the West as infidels and that seek the elimination of Israel. We should not forget who Hamas is.
Washington, pay attention to Khaled Abu Tuameh. You said it. Nothing else needs to be said other than thanking you for giving us the real insight. And it's the bottom line on Al-Shakar Al-Savlana. Stay tuned, because the drama in Gaza only continues, and we'll be there to reveal it all from the center of the Middle East, Jerusalem. Thanks very much, Khaled Abu Tuameh.
Thank you, though.